On today's video, I'll refinish this old table.
Like this wasn't here yesterday.
I found this in a thrift store. I don't know much about it. I'm not sure who made it or when it was made, but I would guess it was probably made in the 1950s or 60s. It's been painted. It looks like somebody painted it white with a brush. And the paint job is in rough shape. I wasn't sure at first if I even liked the table when I first saw it, but it grew on me, so I decided to take it home and refinish it. The first thing I did was to disassemble it as much as I could, and thankfully this was held together by screws. There was no glue involved, so I just needed to remove all the screws that I could to take it apart. Some of the plugs for the screw holes were already missing, but for the ones that were still remaining, I just drilled them out. And then I could replace them later on with new ones. As I was taking this piece off, I found a metal tag on it, and I could just barely see some numbers stamped in it. So later on, I would remove the paint to see if there was any other identifying information on the tag. I also found a couple of big cracks in this piece, so before I removed the finish, I glued the two pieces back together. Once the glue was dry, then I attempted to remove the paint from that tag, but without removing any writing that was on it. So I just gently went over it with a utility knife blade. And it says property of Twin City Federal, which I'm assuming is or was a bank. So this was probably bank furniture. And then I could remove the paint. And to do this, I just used a scraper. and it wasn't too difficult to get the paint off. And most of the original finish underneath the paint also came off with the paint. I did find a photo of an identical table online with its original finish, and the original finish was a pretty typical brownish stained finish. But there was something about the form of this piece that I felt looked best with a light color finish. So my plan was to refinish it, but not to the original brown color, but to a lighter color, but without painting it. This section was a little tricky, but I was able to get in there with a smaller scraper. Once I had all the paint off, then I went over the surface with some 120 grit sandpaper to remove anything that was left on the surface. And later on, I would sand up to 220 grit before putting the finish on. And it's solid, there's no veneer here, so I didn't have to worry about sanding through the veneer. And it looked like this was probably birch. I'm not positive, but I'm going to go with birch. Once I got it sanded clean, then I just wet it down with some water to give me an idea of what it would look like if I put just a clear finish on it. And as is pretty typical of birch, it looked kind of blotchy and a yellowish orange color. And while that can be a good look sometimes, I really liked the way it looked in white. So I wanted to try and get the wood a lighter color and less yellowy orange. But first, I had to repair a little ding that I made in this piece. I dropped it on the driveway as I was working with it, and it got a little dent or ding in it. So to try and fix this, I first applied some water to it, and then took a hot soldering iron and a wet rag and applied the hot soldering iron to the dent to get those wood fibers to come up again. And there were actually two dents. One on the left is very small, and then the one on the right, which is a little bigger and more noticeable. And this worked great. The smaller one, especially, was steamed out completely, and the bigger one was probably about 95% fixed, which was good enough for me. So I knew I wanted to try and lighten the wood and get it as close to white as I could without paint. So the first thing I tried was this wood bleach. This is a 2-part bleach. It comes with 2 solutions. One is sodium hydroxide, which is also known as lye, and hydrogen peroxide. First, I applied the sodium hydroxide, and this actually turned the wood darker, but in a way that I kind of liked. I've read that lye can be used to darken wood and to basically give it the color of old wood. And that's what it seemed to do here. And I almost left it like that, but I decided to stick with the plan. But I'll remember this trick for future projects where I want to darken a piece of wood. And then while that solution is still wet on the surface, I applied the hydrogen peroxide. And you can kind of see on the far side of the board, it looks like it's turning white. But that's not actually the color of the wood turning white, it's the solution on top of it. It's foaming a little bit. I guess that's what happens when you mix these two solutions together. And then, per the instructions, I left it overnight to dry. And the next day, I sanded all the parts lightly with some 220 grit just to remove any residue that was left over from the bleaching process. And while the wood did look lighter when it was dry, I had to wet it down to really give me a sense of the true color that it would be when I applied some finish. So I wet it down, and once it was wet, I could see that it did get lighter, but not as light as I wanted it. And it was still kind of yellowish. So the bleach got me part of the way there, but not all the way. So next, I decided to apply some white gel stain. I've used gel stain a lot, but I've never used white gel stain. So this was a first for me. And this is an oil-based gel stain. I applied it with a foam brush, and I evened out the coverage as best I could with the brush. And then lightly went over it with a paper towel to finish it off. And it may not look great on camera. The lighting here is not good, but it actually looked really good. I was really happy with how it looked because it was white, but you could still see some of the grain through the stain, but it wasn't blotchy either. Because the gel stain doesn't get absorbed into the wood as much as a liquid stain would. And also, I sanded this wood to 220 grit instead of the recommended 150 grit that's recommended by the stain manufacturer because I didn't want it to get absorbed very much. So with the 220 grit sandpaper, it's a smoother surface, so the wood doesn't hold on to as much stain. So the first application of stain looked great, but I felt like I should apply just one more to help even it out a little bit more. So I let the first coat dry completely and then applied a light second coat of stain. Once the stain was dry, then I could apply the top coat. And in this case, I chose a satin spray lacquer. And then I could put it all back together. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.